One of the things that's the most fascinating to me is I love the founding story of Kiva Robotics. Are you familiar with this one, or just the concept behind how they went about designing what they did?
No, I'm not. Feel free to share for myself and the listeners because I know the back end of their story, not the front end of their story.
Yeah, so effectively, like what they did is they took a step back and asked one question. If labor was totally expensive, what would we do? Right? And they effectively said, all right, we would reduce the amount of time that people are walking. We'd have inventory come to them, and that's what we do. And they said, okay, if we asked the other question and labor was free and it was infinite, what would you do? And they said you would have one person holding one item and sitting in a row, and when you need them, they would walk and give it to you. They said, okay, let's solve for both of these extremes. Let's have it so that you effectively have these robots that have a very defined storage amount, so a very defined SKU that they're holding. Let them sit in a queue somewhere, and when you need them, they come to you. And that's effectively the idea behind why Kiva became Kiva and why they went that particular route. As you think about all of this change that's happening in robotics today, are there any specific either frameworks that people are changing and how they think about things, or just key technology that is moving things in a new direction?
I think there's a lot of different things that people are thinking about. And up until now, I feel like most everybody's focused on labor cost and activity throughput, right? So that's how you try to build your ROI study. And then and basically left it at labor. And I think now we're starting to see people take into account the warehouse and the cube of the warehouse and how much space there is above because warehouses are limited to 7 feet high of like effective workspace because our reach and people and probably realistically 6 feet if you think about it through the lens of ergonomics and safety. And yet all the buildings keep getting taller and they're living like 36, 38, 40 feet clear. And yet the productive space is like the first 6 feet. And so now there's solutions like when we talked about automated storage and retrieval, they're looking at it through the lens of cubing and getting rid of the racking, getting rid of the aisles, and working vertically in a building. And therefore, you can now shrink a footprint if you start in a greenfield environment. And so instead of needing maybe 1 million square feet of operational space because of using the other 20 some feet that everybody's wasting, they're now saying, hey, I might be able to get away with 200 or 300,000 square feet. So I think people now need to start considering because buildings got really expensive in the last couple of years because of demand and all the inflationary stuff that's going on there. And the ROI models need to start thinking about square footage cost and how do I take advantage of this space above my first 6 or 7 feet of the warehouse and how do I make that productive and safe? And so I think that's one component of it. I think the other thing that people forget about when they get so hyper fixated on throughput, they forget about the things that feed that system. And so they don't account for the delay of waiting on, you were talking about in your analysis, like with goods to person, like the picker has to wait for that bot to show up in order to get the item. And people a lot of times forget about that travel time and just think that the person standing there all day doing this and there's like an infinite number of bins just waiting on them and it's not. And so people do need to account for what is the input or output. Does this new automation need somebody or something to be done before it gets to there? And then does it also feed into this other component? And there's this concept that I hear often called islands of automation where you automate something, but then they're like on these islands and they're separate from each other and everybody's looking through the perfect lens of my activity and my activity only, but there might be 2 activities before it and 3 activities after it in a chain. And so I think people are starting to realize and figure out there's other things that I got to account for downtime of waiting for the next bin of units to come to me as an example, or the next bin that goes out from here, it has to go to somebody else. So I think those are the biggest things that people didn't realize in the early days and got caught off guard and now are changing it for sure.
It's classic drum buffer rope mentality from a factory that comes into fulfillment center. And so I'm just to talk about Nibble a little bit. How have you guys approached those paradigms?
We created a measuring stick that we call raw UPH or units per hour that's accounting for the end to end and not just looking at the picking activity or the packing activity, but the shuttle time plus the picking time plus the packing time so that we can get a real measurement on throughput and number of units that we can productively put through in an hour, accounting for downtime, accounting for wait time, accounting for somebody have to interact with a system or something like that. So I think that's the probably the biggest thing is just rethinking how we measure productivity to be able to account for all that stuff.